The moment they called me redundant, they accidentally shut down half the company without realizing it. That was the thought running through my head the morning Harrison Allied Logistics fired me in front of 37 executives inside Conference Room 14 overlooking downtown Chicago. The strange part was not the firing itself. Corporate America eliminates people every day and calls it restructuring so investors do not panic. No, the strange part was how calm everyone looked while they destroyed the one system holding their operations together. I remember the room smelled like burnt coffee and fresh printer toner. Rain streaked softly across the glass windows while executives flipped through quarterly reports pretending this was another ordinary Tuesday morning. My replacement was already sitting 3 seats away from me before the meeting even started. Olivia Grant, 34 years old. Sharp white blazer. Fresh compliance badge clipped perfectly against her lapel. She smiled too comfortably at Chief Operations Officer Michael Trent while he adjusted the presentation slides near the projector screen. That was the first moment my instincts told me something was wrong. Because executives never place replacements inside meetings, unless the decision has already been finalized behind closed doors. I slowly opened my leather portfolio and reviewed the operational audit reports I finished at almost 2 o'clock that morning after 14 straight hours of work. Again, 21 years at Harrison Allied Logistics, and I still worked longer days than executives half my age. My daughter used to joke that the company would probably bury me with a laptop in my hands one day. At the time I laughed. Now I realize she was warning me. Michael stepped toward the front of the room exactly at 8 a.m. wearing his usual charcoal suit and silver watch polished bright beneath the overhead lights. Calm. Relaxed. The kind of confidence executives develop after years of making dangerous decisions from safe distances. Before we begin regional projections, he announced smoothly, we need to address several organizational efficiency updates. Organizational efficiency. There. It was. The corporate phrase companies use when they want to erase someone without admitting the real reason. My stomach tightened quietly. Because Michael never handled personnel matters personally unless legal exposure or board optics were involved. The room became completely silent. Not surprised silent. Corporate silent. The kind where everyone suddenly studies laptops and notebooks because they already know someone's life is about to collapse publicly. Michael folded his hands together carefully. Effective immediately, Diane Mercer's position has been eliminated due to operational redundancy within the compliance division. No private conversation beforehand. No warning. No dignity. Just elimination. Like outdated software. For a few seconds nobody moved. I remember hearing the projector fan humming overhead, while rain tapped softly against the windows behind us. One of the junior managers looked horrified. Human Resources Director Karen Ellis stared down at her folder instead of looking directly at me. Olivia stopped typing immediately. Interesting. People avoid eye contact once guilt enters the room. I remained perfectly still. That mattered. Because women over 40 learn quickly inside executive environments that the moment you show emotion publicly, leadership stops calling you professional. Suddenly you become unstable. Emotional. Difficult. I refused to give Michael Trent that satisfaction. Leadership responsibilities will be redistributed across multiple departments moving forward, he continued calmly. Redistributed. Another favorite corporate word for replacing experienced employees with younger, cheaper ones. My fingers tightened slightly around the edge of my portfolio, but my expression never changed. 21 years. 21 years fixing operational failures nobody else wanted attached to their names. I canceled anniversaries during federal audits. Missed holidays during emergency shipping crises. Took compliance calls from hospital waiting rooms while my father was dying because Michael said the state review could not survive instability right now. And now he was erasing me between quarterly reports and catered breakfast pastries. Security will assist Diane with collecting personal belongings after the meeting, Michael added. Security. After 21 years. The humiliation was intentional now. A performance for everyone else in the room. I slowly closed my portfolio while nobody spoke. Not one person. That hurt more than losing the job itself. Because I protected these people. Covered mistakes quietly so younger managers would not lose promotions. Stayed overnight during licensing emergencies while executives slept comfortably at home. Built systems nobody noticed because they work too well. Michael finally looked directly at me. We appreciate your years of service. Years of service. Like I was retiring from a county office instead of being erased before lunch. I stood slowly. My knees did not shake. I am still proud of that. Karen from Human Resources approached carefully near the doorway holding a severance folder against her chest, while a security officer waited several feet behind her pretending not to listen. As I stepped toward the exit, my eyes drifted briefly toward Olivia's open laptop. And that is when I noticed it. My federal operating authorization portal already active under transition review. The transfer paperwork had been started before they fired me. Weeks before. Maybe longer. And standing there inside conference room 14 while 37 executives pretended not to stare at me, I realized something Michael Trent still did not understand. Harrison Allied Logistics did not just terminate an employee that morning. They terminated the only person legally attached to the operating license, allowing half their regional freight network to function. The hallway outside conference room 14 felt colder than usual. Not physically. Emotionally. The kind of cold that settles over executive floors after people witness something cruel and decide silence is safer than decency. Karen Ellis from Human Resources walked beside me holding the severance folder, while the security officer followed several steps behind us toward the elevators pretending not to listen. Nobody said anything at first. What exactly do you say to a woman who just lost 21 years of her life? In under 5 minutes? The elevator doors opened softly. I stepped inside carrying the cardboard box Human Resources handed me near the conference room entrance. Small box. Cheap cardboard. Barely large enough to hold 2 decades of sacrifice. Funny how corporations reduce people so efficiently once leadership decides they are inconvenient. Karen cleared her throat carefully. I know this must feel sudden. Sudden. Interesting word. The announcement may have been sudden. The betrayal was not. Now that I saw the pattern clearly, dozens of strange moments from the past several months suddenly made sense. Olivia joining compliance calls unexpectedly. Information technology requesting secondary access to licensing systems. Michael asking unusual questions about federal authorization renewal procedures. They had been preparing my replacement long before they publicly eliminated me. The elevator reached the executive floor. When the doors opened, my stomach tightened immediately. Olivia was sitting inside my office. My office. My framed family photo had already been removed from the bookshelf. The orchid near the window was gone. Even my Operational Excellence Award from 2019 had disappeared from the wall. They erased me before telling me I no longer worked there. Efficient. Clean. Corporate. Olivia froze the moment she saw me standing in the doorway. Panic crossed her face briefly before she stood too quickly from behind my desk. I thought Human Resources would bring you later, she whispered nervously. Interesting wording. Not, I am sorry. Not, I did not know. Just surprise about timing. Meaning she already knew everything. Karen shifted awkwardly beside me while the security officer stared toward the hallway pretending not to hear us. Olivia grabbed her tablet too quickly and nearly dropped it against the desk before rushing toward the door. But as she passed me, she hesitated. I have always respected what you built here, she said quietly. Built. Past tense. Then she disappeared down the hallway in heels that clicked too fast against the marble floors. I stepped slowly into the office that used to belong to me. 21 years of missed holidays, emergency audits, and 14-hour workdays compressed into one corner office overlooking downtown Chicago. And somehow it already looked like I had never been there. I opened the center desk drawer instinctively. Empty. Someone had already cleaned it out. Then my eyes landed on an open notebook beside Olivia's laptop. Handwritten notes covered the page. Federal transfer approval pending. Operating authorization reassignment. Diane dependency issue. I stared at those 3 words for several seconds while rain drifted softly across the windows behind me. Dependency issue. That is what Michael Trent believed I was. Not leadership. Not experience. Problem. And standing there inside my half-erased office while the city disappeared beneath gray February skies, something cold settled deeply inside my chest for the first time since the firing. Clarity. Because Harrison Allied Logistics did not remove me because I failed operationally. They removed me because too many critical systems still depended on a license only I legally controlled. The drive home felt unreal. Chicago traffic crawled beneath dark gray skies while the cardboard box sat quietly in the passenger seat beside me like evidence from someone else's collapse. 21 years reduced to a box holding framed photographs, 2 notebooks, a dying orchid plant, and a coffee mug from Harrison Allied Logistics' 2018 executive retreat. Funny what corporations decide people are worth carrying out the door. I stopped at a red light near Lakeshore Drive and stared at my reflection in the windshield. 51 years old. Senior Compliance Director. Publicly terminated before noon. And somehow I still looked composed. That almost made it worse. Because women like me learn very early inside corporate America that composure becomes survival. You cry later. Alone. Never inside the building. My phone buzzed against the center console. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Then it rang again. Diane Mercer. I answered quietly through the speakers. A brief pause followed. Then a familiar voice lowered itself carefully against the line. It is Alan Pierce. Compliance Division. Of course. His voice sounded tight. Controlled but tight. You probably should not be calling me, I said carefully while traffic crept slowly forward outside. You are probably right, he admitted. Silence settled briefly between us. Then Alan lowered his voice even further. The federal reassignment request was rejected 30 minutes ago. My grip tightened slightly around the steering wheel. There it was. The first crack. Rejected by who? I asked calmly. Department of Transportation Licensing Review Board. Alan exhaled softly. Apparently your certification falls under grandfathered interstate authorization rules from the 2003 merger period. My stomach turned cold immediately. Of course it did. I personally handled the compliance consolidation during the merger because nobody else understood the federal restructuring requirements back then. 21 years ago executives treated it like administrative paperwork. Now half the company depended on it legally. Rain tapped softly against the windshield while downtown Chicago blurred beneath evening traffic ahead of me. Michael thinks legal can fix it quickly, Alan continued carefully. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because executives always believe systems are replaceable once they stop respecting the people maintaining them. Can they? I asked quietly. Another silence. Longer this time. Then finally, no. I turned slowly onto my street while headlights reflected across wet pavement outside. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had that morning. White porch lights. Bare winter trees. Ordinary houses carrying ordinary lives untouched by corporate collapse. Strange how the world continues moving normally after your career disappears before lunch. Alan lowered his voice again. Diane, operations leadership is panicking internally. Nervous. Not confident. Not prepared. Panicking. That word mattered. Because companies only panic once they realize the infrastructure holding everything together was never the building. Never the software. Never the executives standing behind podiums. It was the invisible person quietly keeping the system alive while nobody noticed. By the next morning, Harrison Allied Logistics stopped pretending the situation was temporary. That was the first real shift. The emails became shorter, more urgent. Executives who normally took 2 days to respond suddenly answered within minutes. Fear changes communication patterns very quickly inside corporate America. Rain rolled softly against my kitchen windows while I sat staring at untouched coffee, and the severance folder spread open across the dining room table. 38 pages of legal language carefully designed to sound respectful, while protecting the company from collapse. My laptop chimed again. Another anonymous internal message. Emergency legal meeting at 7:30. Regional operations delayed in Missouri and Indiana. No signature. Still no signature. Someone inside the company was feeding me information now. That mattered. Employees only leak information once they stop believing leadership can stabilize the situation internally. My phone rang before I could think further. Olivia Grant. I almost ignored it. Almost. Her voice sounded tighter than usual the moment I answered. Diane. Have you spoken with anyone from the licensing board? Direct question. No small talk. Interesting. Why would you ask that? I replied calmly while watching rain streak slowly across the backyard outside. A brief silence followed. Then quietly, 3 transfer requests were denied overnight. There it was. The first visible fracture. I leaned back slowly in the chair while morning light reflected dimly across the kitchen floor. How many regional operations are affected right now? Too much silence. Then finally, 6. 6 regions. In less than 24 hours. My expression never changed, but something inside me sharpened immediately. This was not revenge. That part mattered. I had not contacted regulators strategically, had not exposed confidential systems, had not sabotaged anything. Harrison Allied Logistics was destabilizing itself, trying to replace infrastructure leadership never understood properly. Olivia exhaled softly. Michael thinks legal can appeal the restrictions. I almost smiled. Not out of cruelty. Out of clarity. Because federal operating licenses do not function like executive job titles. They cannot simply be reassigned because leadership feels inconvenienced. 21 years earlier, during the interstate merger consolidation, I became the officially recognized compliance authority under grandfathered transportation regulations that no longer even existed for new applicants. Harrison knew that. Or at least they should have. Outside, cold February rain darkened the neighborhood while my orchid plant sat quietly near the window beside the severance paperwork. Funny how living things begin recovering once removed from toxic environments. Olivia lowered her voice again. The board is asking questions now. Board questions. Another dangerous sign. Because once boards become directly involved in operational licensing failures, leadership panic spreads very quickly behind closed doors. I stared out across the rain-covered street while silence settled softly through the kitchen. Less than 48 hours earlier, Michael Trent publicly eliminated my position in front of 37 executives, believing the company would continue functioning normally afterward. Now half the regional freight network was slowing down because Harrison Allied Logistics finally discovered something corporations always learn too late. Invisible people are usually holding the entire system together. By Friday afternoon, Harrison Allied Logistics no longer looked stable from the outside. That mattered more than Michael Trent realized. Companies survive financial pressure all the time. What they rarely survive is loss of confidence. And confidence inside corporate America spreads through perception faster than facts. I heard it in Alan Pierce's voice first. The executive floor feels different, he admitted quietly over the phone while I stood near the kitchen sink watching freezing rain collect along the driveway outside. Different how? I asked calmly. Alan exhaled slowly. People are updating resumes during lunch. There it was. The real collapse signal. Not investor panic. Employee escape. Because once senior staff begin preparing exits quietly, trust inside leadership disappears almost overnight. My laptop chimed again across the kitchen counter. Another anonymous internal message. Insurance. Carriers requesting operational clarification. Vendor partnerships under review. I stared at the screen silently. Insurance carriers. That was bad. Very bad. Because insurance providers hear instability before investors do. My phone buzzed almost immediately afterward. Michael Trent. First direct call since the firing. I answered calmly. His voice sounded different this time. Still controlled. Still executive polished. But underneath, exhaustion. Diane, he said carefully, we need to discuss several ongoing operational concerns. Need. Not want. Need. Interesting difference. I leaned slowly against the kitchen counter while cold rain streaked softly across the windows behind me. What exactly do you need from me, Michael? A small silence followed. Then finally, regional transfer approvals remained suspended. There it was. Official now. Not whispers. Not concern. Action. Outside, gray February skies darkened the neighborhood while downtown Chicago disappeared beneath freezing rain several miles away. Meanwhile, Harrison Allied Logistics, the same company that publicly escorted me out with security 4 days earlier, was quietly losing legal control of its freight operations across multiple states. Michael lowered his voice. The board believes this situation is becoming reputational. Reputational. Corporate language again. Translated honestly, the industry is losing confidence in us. I closed my eyes briefly. Not out of satisfaction. Out of clarity. Because Michael still did not understand the real problem. This was never about Diane Mercer leaving the company. It was about Harrison Allied Logistics publicly proving how little leadership understood the systems keeping the business legally operational. You should have reviewed the federal authorization structure before eliminating compliance leadership, I said calmly. Silence. Heavy silence. The kind executives sit in once they realize the consequences are larger than their original decision. Finally, Michael spoke again, quieter this time. Legal says the grandfathered certification cannot be reassigned quickly. I looked down at the severance folder still sitting open across my kitchen table. 21 years of invisible labor reduced to 38 pages of exit paperwork. No, iraplia sufli. It cannot. Another silence settled between us before I finally added the sentence Michael Trent would probably remember for the rest of his career. You did not terminate a position, I told him quietly. You terminated the infrastructure. 2 weeks after my firing, the atmosphere around Harrison Allied Logistics had changed completely. You could feel it in the emails, the wording, the hesitation. Executives who once sounded polished now sounded careful. Vendors started asking unusual questions about continuity planning. Clients requested private operational calls instead of group meetings. Fear changes communication patterns very quickly inside corporate America. I was sitting in my home office reviewing independent consulting paperwork when my phone rang again. Unknown Manhattan number. I answered cautiously. Diane Mercer. A warm male voice responded almost immediately. Diane, this is Victor Lang from Eastbridge Transportation Group. Eastbridge, one of Harrison's largest competitors on the East Coast. Interesting. I leaned back slowly in the chair while evening light reflected across the windows overlooking my neighborhood. What can I do for you, Victor? He laughed softly. Based on recent industry conversations, probably quite a lot. There it was. The whispers had spread beyond Chicago now. Not publicly. Quietly. The dangerous kind of attention corporations cannot control once executives begin talking privately at industry dinners and investor calls. Victor lowered his voice slightly. I understand Harrison is experiencing operational authorization complications. Complications. Another polished executive word. Translated honestly, they removed the wrong person and now the system is breaking. I no longer work there, I replied calmly. Exactly, Victor answered. Silence settled briefly between us while headlights drifted slowly across the street outside my office windows. Then he finally said the sentence that changed everything. Eastbridge would like to discuss an executive partnership opportunity. I remained quiet. Not because I was shocked. Because part of me had already realized this moment was coming. Invisible labor only becomes valuable publicly once corporations lose access to it. Victor continued carefully. We reviewed your federal authorization history from the interstate merger years ago. Frankly, there are maybe 6 people in the country with equivalent operational standing. 6. 21 years at Harrison Allied Logistics and nobody inside executive leadership had ever once described my role that way. Not irreplaceable. Not essential. Just dependable. Reliable. Stable. The words companies use for women they expect to sacrifice quietly forever. Outside, freezing rain rolled softly against the windows while darkness settled across the neighborhood. I am not interested in revenge, I said finally. Victor laughed again, softer this time. That is exactly why everyone trusts you. Another silence followed before he continued. For what it is worth, Diane, the industry is not blaming you for Harrison's collapse. Collapse. Interesting. That word had finally entered conversations openly now. Not instability. Not restructuring complications. Collapse. I stared quietly toward the rain-covered street outside while my orchid plant sat healthier near the office window than it ever looked inside the executive tower downtown. Funny how living things recover once removed from toxic systems. Victor lowered his voice one final time before ending the call. Their board is already discussing removing Michael Trent. I closed my eyes briefly after the line disconnected. 2 weeks earlier, Michael stood confidently beneath conference room lights believing he was eliminating operational redundancy. Now the same executives who applauded my removal were apparently discussing how to remove him instead. Corporate America moves very quickly once power starts collapsing in the wrong direction. 3 weeks after Michael Trent fired me in front of the executive boardroom, Harrison Allied Logistics officially suspended interstate expansion operations across 4 regional markets. That announcement spread through transportation circles faster than Michael probably expected, because Harrison never paused expansion projects. Not once in nearly 12 years. They branded themselves as one of the most operationally stable logistics firms in the Midwest. And suddenly freight routes were being delayed quietly, while legal departments scrambled behind closed doors trying to explain authorization gaps to state regulators. No public scandal. No dramatic press conference. Just absence. In corporate America, absence speaks loudly. I learned about it during lunch with Alan Pierce downtown. The restaurant overlooked the Chicago River while executives filled nearby tables pretending not to overhear one another's conversations. Alan stirred his coffee slowly before finally speaking. People are calling it an executive failure case study now. Case study. Interesting wording. Cleaner than saying leadership destroyed its own infrastructure through arrogance. I sat quietly while waiters moved between tables carrying expensive lunches executives barely tasted during stressful weeks like this. How bad is it internally? I asked carefully. Alan hesitated before answering. 7 senior managers resigned in under 18 days. 7. Not layoffs. Voluntary departures. That mattered more. Because people closest to leadership always recognize collapse first. My phone buzzed softly beside the water glass. Unknown number. I answered cautiously. Diane Mercer. A nervous female voice responded immediately. Ms. Mercer, this is Claire Donahue from Harrison Legal. Legal. Of course. Her voice sounded exhausted before she even continued. The board would like to request a private meeting regarding federal operational restoration. Restoration. Corporate language desperately trying not to say panic. I looked out across the gray river beyond the restaurant windows while freezing wind pushed against downtown traffic outside. What exactly are they hoping to restore? I asked calmly. Silence. Then finally, confidence. That almost made me smile. Not licenses. Not contracts. Confidence. Because after weeks of operational confusion, Harrison finally understood the real problem was never paperwork. It was trust. Alan watched my expression carefully while Claire continued speaking softly through the phone. Several carriers are reconsidering long-term partnerships. Insurance providers are escalating review procedures. Investors are requesting emergency clarification calls. Every sentence confirmed the same truth. Harrison Allied Logistics was not collapsing because I sabotaged the company. It was collapsing because leadership publicly revealed how fragile the operation already was underneath me. Claire lowered her voice even further. Michael Trent resigned this morning. There it was. Official now. I closed my eyes briefly while restaurant conversations blurred quietly around me. 3 weeks earlier Michael stood confidently beneath executive lights believing he controlled the room. Now he was gone. Not because I destroyed him. Because arrogance inside corporate leadership eventually destroys itself once consequences finally arrive. Please tell the board I appreciate the invitation, I said calmly before ending the call. Alan stared at me across the table for several seconds. You are not going back there, are you? I looked toward the freezing Chicago skyline outside the restaurant windows and answered honestly. No, because for the first time in 21 years, my future no longer belonged to a company that only understood my value after losing access to it. 1 month after my firing, Harrison Allied Logistics officially withdrew from the National Freight Operations Summit in Dallas. That announcement moved through executive circles faster than any press release could have. Because Harrison never missed national logistics conferences. Not once in over a decade. They sponsored keynote panels, hosted investor dinners, positioned themselves as one of the safest transportation firms in the country. And suddenly their name disappeared from the attendee roster completely. No statement. No explanation. Just silence. In corporate America, silence usually means damage control has already failed internally. I learned about it while sitting inside a downtown conference lounge preparing paperwork for Eastbridge Transportation Group. Large windows overlooked the Chicago skyline, while executives hurried between meetings carrying leather portfolios and exhausted expressions. Funny how every industry eventually starts looking the same once you survive long enough inside it. My phone buzzed softly across the table. Claire Donahue again. Harrison Legal. I answered calmly. Her voice sounded even more tired than before. The board finalized leadership restructuring this morning, she said quietly. Leadership restructuring. Corporate wording for collapse management. Who replaced Michael? I asked. A pause followed. Then, nobody permanently yet. That mattered. Companies only delay executive appointments once internal confidence disappears completely. Claire lowered her voice further. Several board members believe the public termination triggered the operational crisis. Triggered, not caused. Even now they still struggled to admit the truth honestly. I stared across the lounge while snow drifted softly outside the glass windows beyond the skyline. No, irraplia carafulli. The firing exposed the crisis. It did not create it. Silence settled briefly between us before Claire finally sighed. I think they understand that now. Nearby, executives moved through the lounge discussing market forecasts and expansion strategies, while my laptop displayed preliminary partnership contracts from Eastbridge. For weeks earlier I walked out of Harrison carrying a cardboard box wondering whether my career was finished. Now competing firms were offering executive equity packages simply because the industry finally understood how much infrastructure I quietly carried for 21 years. Claire spoke again softly. For what it is worth, Diane, people inside the company are talking about you differently now. Interesting. How differently? I asked. Another pause. Then finally, like the person who was holding everything together. I looked down at the contract sitting open beside my coffee cup, while evening sunlight reflected softly against the conference lounge windows. Funny how invisible labor only becomes visible once corporations lose access to it permanently. Claire hesitated before asking one final question. Do you hate them? Hate. Such a simple word for something corporate America complicates endlessly through policies and executive speeches. I thought about the conference room humiliation. The security escort. The cardboard box. The years I sacrificed believing loyalty guaranteed protection. Then I answered honestly. No, I said quietly. But I finally understand them now. After the call ended, I sat alone for several seconds watching snow fall slowly beyond the skyline, while the city moved quietly beneath winter light. Harrison Allied Logistics spent 21 years teaching me how corporations reward obedience. Losing everything there finally taught me something far more valuable. Never confuse being needed with being respected. Because the moment companies stop respecting the people holding them together, collapse becomes only a matter of time.